The airlock hissed, and the last seal closed behind Commander Elias Varga as he stepped onto the observation deck. Beyond the reinforced viewport, the void stretched black and absolute, a canvas dotted with distant stars and the glimmer of nearby research stations. He ran a gloved hand over the cool railing, listening to the soft hum of the ship's systems, feeling the familiar tension in his chest that never fully faded in deep space. Reports had arrived hours earlier, an anomalous energy signature detected near the Lagrange Delta Array, far stronger than any known quantum fluctuation. They called it Delta 9 for months. Theoretical physicists had speculated about multiversal interactions, parallel realities brushing against our own, but no one had ever seen anything that could be measured. Now, they might have, and Varga's fleet had been tasked with getting close enough to study it. The bridge was a flurry of activity. Lieutenant Mara Chen, tactical officer and a savant in pattern recognition, monitored dozens of sensor feeds. Her eyes darted between streams of data, color-coded for anomalies in subspace frequencies, particle flux, and radiation spikes. She tapped the side of her headset. "Commander, we're seeing repeated phase echoes. They're not random. Someone, or something, is manipulating the interference patterns." Her voice was precise, clipped yet tinged with unease. Varga moved to her console, scanning the holographic display. Echoes rippled across the sensor grid like water disturbed by stones. Each pulse carried energy readings that exceeded the ship's shield capacity for sustained exposure. "Any way to trace origin points?" he asked. "We're trying. The problem is, it's moving, but not in any conventional trajectory. More like it's folding in on itself." Mara's fingers danced over the console, pulling in supplemental readings from drones dispatched to the periphery of the anomaly. "Whatever it is, it's intelligent, or at least patterned. Not natural." In the science lab, Dr. Ilan Serov crouched over a portable spectrometer, sweat gathering at his brow. Serov was brilliant, yes, but he carried the weight of his own skepticism. He had spent 15 years chasing quantum oddities, and most turned out to be statistical noise or equipment errors. But Delta 9 was different. The readings were coherent, consistent, and lethal to anyone who tried to get too close without shielding. He looked up at Varga when the commander entered. "We're not just seeing parallel possibilities. We're seeing echoes of them interacting with us. It's like multiple realities brushing against this one. And if we misstep, we could tear a hole that no one can contain." Varga nodded. "So the question isn't whether it's dangerous. It's when it will hit us." The first skirmish arrived before anyone had time to form a proper plan. Drones dispatched to map Delta 9 returned with shredded sensors and panicked telemetry. The interference had produced localized temporal distortions, freezing drones mid-flight and then accelerating them unpredictably. It was as if the field itself rejected observation. "They're eating our eyes before we can even see them," Mara said quietly, her knuckles white on the console. The fleet was forced to retreat to the edges of the anomaly's range. Varga convened an emergency strategy session. Captain Juno Kale, pilot of the assault frigate Aegis, leaned forward. Her hands were scuffed from long hours at the helm, and her eyes had the sharp calculation of someone used to making life and death decisions in milliseconds. "Well, we can't just sit here," she said. "If this is the first phase, more could be coming. We need a probe, or a strike team to figure out its weaknesses." Dr. Serov shook his head. "We can't strike it conventionally. Kinetics and energy weapons only scatter the interference and feed it more energy. We don't understand the feedback loop. One wrong move could—" His words hung in the air, unfinished. Varga cut him off. "Then we improvise. That's what humans do." Their first attempt to engage with Delta 9 involved an experimental quantum probe, designed to phase partially into the anomaly without destabilizing it completely. The probe was piloted remotely by Mara, with Serov guiding the field calibrations. The moment it entered the fringe of the anomaly, the sensors went haywire. Every gauge flickered between impossibility and silence. Then came the first indication of intelligence, a pulse of energy that precisely countered the probe's movements, redirecting it violently. The probe's hull cracked under the strain, telemetry streaming corrupted signals. Mara leaned back, stunned. It anticipated us." "Yes," Serov said, voice tight. "Not just anticipated, adapted." Kyle's voice came through the comm from the hangar bay, tense and sharp. "Commander, we're not just dealing with a phenomenon. This is something that can fight back, and it learns faster than we do." The night stretched long as the crew regrouped. Varga walked the corridors, observing the silent tension in each crew member. Engineers whispered about shielding modifications. Analysts muttered about probability calculations that made no sense. The anomaly didn't just distort matter and energy, it warped understanding itself. Hours later, the first breakthrough came from an unlikely source. A junior data analyst, Hera Dane, who had been monitoring interference patterns and random noise as a hobby. "Commander," she said, pointing at her console, "I think I see a repetition in the chaos. It's subtle, but it looks like a cycle. It's weak at certain intervals. If we time it, maybe we can slip a probe through without triggering a violent feedback." Varga's eyes narrowed. "Cycle or pattern?" "Cycle," she insisted. "At least something predictable enough for a blind run." It was the first ray of hope. Varga convened a rapid planning session. Charts were drawn, simulations run, and each step of the operation rehearsed down to fractions of a second. Kyle volunteered to pilot the next probe, a heavily shielded vessel, with Mara and Seraph running synchronized calculations to keep the ship aligned with the predicted phase gaps. The plan was simple: penetrate the anomaly long enough to gather usable data, then retreat before feedback could overwhelm the hull. The execution was tense beyond measure. The ship trembled under forces that should not have existed. Shields flared with ghostly light as the probe slipped through the first wave of interference. Then abruptly, the anomaly pulsed like a heartbeat, almost aware of its own violation. Kale's hands were steady on the controls, her jaw set. Mara shouted corrections over the comm as Seraph fed in real-time calculations. A delicate ballet of probability and physics. And then the probe emerged. Intact, but battered, streaming data that defied conventional interpretation. There were glimpses of other realities, faint but undeniable. Structures that mirrored their own universe, landscapes that twisted in impossible geometries, and strange signals that hinted at intelligence. Varga exhaled slowly. We're seeing it. We're seeing other worlds, but even as the crew celebrated the small victory, the anomaly reacted. A wave of energy rippled across the observation deck viewport, shimmering like liquid glass. Sensors screamed. Hull integrity warnings blared. It wasn't done learning. It wasn't done adapting. And if they weren't careful, it might never let them leave. Mara's voice cut through the chaos. Commander, it's moving, not just shifting. It's coming toward us. Varga's gaze hardened. Then we prepare. Whatever it is, wherever it came from, we're not running. We fight, we endure. And we survive. That's what humans do. Beyond the viewport, Delta 9 shimmered like a living thing, and the first hints of its full danger began to make themselves known. The void was no longer empty, and the battle for understanding and survival had only just begun. A new pulse erupted from the anomaly, and the deck shook violently. The first casualties of curiosity had been claimed, and somewhere in the rippling shadows of possibility, intelligence waited, patient and unrelenting. Varga clenched his fists. All right, he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. Let's find out what we're really dealing with. The probe's data flickered on the screens, a promise of revelation and a warning of consequences. And in that moment, everyone aboard understood. The multiverse was not a theory anymore. It was a threat. And the humans tasked with confronting it were the first line of defense against realities that could swallow them whole. The anomaly pulsed again, larger this time, almost rhythmic. Every sensor aboard screamed in protest. It was learning from them, adapting, reshaping the rules of physics around their presence. Kale's voice was steady in the comm, but edged with tension. Commander, if we miscalculate, we won't just lose the ship. We'll be rewriting the local space-time. There's no coming back from that. Varga's jaw tightened. Then we don't miscalculate. We make the impossible work. That's the human way. A sudden shudder ran through the hull, louder than any warning. The anomaly's tendrils of energy stretched outward, shimmering with impossible geometry. For a fleeting second, each officer aboard the bridge glimpsed a reflection of themselves, older, younger, in other positions, and other choices. The phenomenon wasn't just spatial or temporal. It was personal. Seraph's face was pale. It's probing us, learning not just our physics, but our minds. Mara's fingers flew across the controls, trying to stabilize the ship. I can hold it for a few minutes, but only if we keep it predictable. One misstep and we're gone, Kale gritted her teeth. Then let's keep moving. As the first wave of the anomaly's feedback washed across the deck, systems overloaded and alarms shrieked, Varga looked at his crew. Fear, yes, but also determination. They had entered the edge of human knowledge, and survival depended on their courage and ingenuity. Every failure would be studied, every mistake catalogued. This was the frontier of reality itself, and the first battle had only just begun. The anomaly pulsed once more, a heartbeat that was not quite a heartbeat. The lights flickered, and then the bridge went silent, save for the sound of Varga's steady breath. The first confrontation with Delta 9 had ended, but none of them would sleep easily again. Somewhere in the folds of the multiverse, something had noticed them, and it was waiting for their next move. The sensors screamed like a chorus of dying stars as the Aegis limped back from the fringe of Delta 9, hull plating scorched in places. Microfractures, tracing jagged veins across the surface. Shielding flickering in rhythmic pulses, as if the anomaly itself were testing the ship's endurance. In the aftermath of their first encounter, the crew moved with the mechanical precision of soldiers trained for repetition. Yet the tension was tangible. Every footstep echoed too loudly. Every murmur, a reminder that even this battered vessel represented humanity's thin line of observation against a reality that defied comprehension. Commander Vargas surveyed the deck from the command platform, hands resting lightly on the rail as he scanned the sensor arrays for anything resembling an actionable pattern. The initial probe run had confirmed what Dr. Seraph had feared. Delta 9 wasn't just an anomaly. It was an adaptive intelligence, operating on scales humans had never conceived. And it was not static. The pulses they had seen were now evolving, complex enough to challenge even Mara Chen's predictive algorithms. Each cycle hinted at a subtle pattern, but the precision needed to exploit it demanded more data, more risk, and more faith than anyone aboard could comfortably afford. "Commander," Mara said, her voice tight over the comms, "I've isolated 3 probable phase gaps. They're narrow, no more than 22 milliseconds in duration. One misalignment and the hull integrity readings spike exponentially. That's at the edge of even the reinforced shielding." Varga exhaled, a slow, deliberate breath. "We'll do it in stages. Kale, can you get a smaller vessel ready? Something agile enough to slip through and retract if the cycle closes early." Captain Juno Kale rubbed her eyes, weary but resolute. "I can prepare the Spectre drone ship. Minimal crew, remote piloting. We can insert it blind and still, maintain some chance of extraction." Her tone carried the weight of someone who had seen far too many ships, shredded in combat simulations that mirrored real encounters. The lab hummed with urgency as Dr. Saroff recalibrated the quantum shielding, running simulations to anticipate the anomaly's adaptive behavior. "We'll need to feed it a variable signature," he said, voice low, "something to confuse its pattern recognition. If it locks onto a single signature, it will adjust and tear the vessel apart in microseconds. But multiple variable pulses may keep it guessing." Hera Dane, sitting cross-legged in front of a console cluttered with holographic projections, perked up. "I've been running stochastic interference overlays. If we modulate the probe's phase fields at irregular intervals, we might extend the gap long enough to collect usable data without triggering a catastrophic feedback loop." Varga nodded slowly. "Do it, and make it happen fast. Every minute we hesitate, Delta 9 adapts further. Every delay is a risk multiplier." The next insertion was a tense choreography of timing and precision. The Spectre slipped from the hangar under Mara's remote guidance, shielding at maximum output, engines humming with calibrated pulses to minimize detectable energy emissions. Kale's hands danced over the control interfaces, micro-adjusting thrusters as the drone entered the periphery of the anomaly. Delta 9 pulsed, stretching and folding, reacting instantly. Mara adjusted the phase modulation in real time, sweat dampening her brow as she calculated probabilities that would have been inconceivable mere weeks earlier. "Steady," Varga murmured, eyes fixed on the holographic feed. The Spectre shuddered violently as the anomaly's tendrils grazed the hull. For a heartbeat, it seemed as though the ship would be ripped apart, yet it held, dancing on the edge of destruction. Dr. Saroff's voice was a calm counterpoint, almost clinical. "Energy readings are stabilizing. The stochastic modulation is holding. Keep the cycle irregular. Now accelerate by 7 milliseconds. No, 8. 8.3. That's it! Hold it there!" The drone slipped deeper, revealing glimpses of impossible geometries and fractured space-time that seemed to mirror, but distort, the universe around them. Reflections of their own ship twisted in ways that made the crew instinctively flinch. Varga felt the weight of human fragility pressing down like gravity. A misstep here could collapse not just a ship, but local causality. Then the first breakthrough arrived. Data streams from the probe showed coherent structures within the anomaly, repeating lattice formations that suggested an intelligence capable of organizing energy and matter on a multiversal scale. It wasn't chaotic. It was meticulous, analytical, almost surgical. Mara's fingers flew over the controls, her eyes wide. "It's calculating responses, but there's a threshold, an edge. It can't adapt beyond a certain frequency without destabilizing itself. We could exploit this," Varga's mind raced. The anomaly had been teaching them its rules through violent feedback, and now they had a weapon, knowledge of its limitations. "Then we push it," he said. "Not with brute force, but with calculated exposure. Let it adapt. Then strike where it falters." But victory demanded a price. The strain on the Spectre was immense, systems warning of overheating phase shielding and microfractures forming in the drone's hull. Kale's voice, calm yet taut, broke the tense silence. "Commander, if we continue at this rate, we'll lose the ship. Extraction is necessary now, or we risk permanent loss." Varga weighed the decision, knowing every second lost was potential knowledge sacrificed. "Bring it out," he ordered. The drone retracted, trembling as the anomaly's energy lashed at it. Yet the modulation held, and the Spectre emerged with critical data intact. Back aboard the Aegis, the lab team dove into the information. They discovered not just lattice formations, but signals, patterns that suggested communication, or perhaps computation, across multiple realities. The realization was staggering. Delta 9 wasn't merely a phenomenon. It was a functioning, intelligent construct operating on a scale humans had never confronted. The news, however, came with political consequences. High Command had been monitoring the anomaly remotely, fearful of both the unknown and the precedent this discovery represented. A conference was convened in zero-G briefing rooms aboard the flagship. Diplomatic liaison. Alara Mock stepped forward, her posture calm but her voice sharp. "Commander Varga, the Council demands containment protocols. You've demonstrated success, yes, but the anomaly is unstable. We cannot risk exposure. Recommendations? Varga's response was measured, deliberate. Containment is a fantasy. Delta 9 is adaptive, learning faster than we can restrict it. The only containment is understanding. We must continue research with calculated insertion and data extraction. Anything less is surrender to an unknown that will not negotiate. Galara's eyes narrowed, tension tight in her jaw. And if your calculated insertions fail, if Delta 9 breaches containment and interacts with civilian systems, Varga's jaw tightened. Then we adapt. We improvise. That's how humans survive. The Council reluctantly accepted provisional clearance, and Varga's team returned to operations. But the moral weight of their work was beginning to fray nerves. Mara remained hyper-focused, yet tremors of fatigue showed in micro-expressions. Kale carried a quiet storm in her eyes, aware of the stakes for herself and the small crew left under her command. Serov's brilliance was shadowed by anxiety. He had glimpsed the power of an intelligence operating beyond human understanding and felt its weight in every decision. Paradane, though young and largely inexperienced, began to shoulder responsibilities far beyond her training, her analytical mind the first line of defense against catastrophe. They launched another probe insertion, this time with multiple drones in staggered sequences, each employing a slightly different stochastic modulation. The plan was to overwhelm Delta 9's adaptive capabilities just enough to map its lattice nodes and communication pathways. As the first drone entered, the anomaly pulsed in recognition, responding instantly to the new sequence. Feedback came faster than ever, and systems overloaded, forcing rapid recalibration. Varga barked orders, his voice cutting through the comms like a scalpel. Mara, adjust modulation by 0.67 milliseconds. Kale, stagger the second drone by 6.2. Serov, keep the phase stabilizers within 2% tolerance, now. The bridge became a storm of activity, each member operating at the peak of human cognitive endurance. Lights flickered under the stress of feedback, shields flared, and alarms screamed. And yet, somehow, the drones emerged, battered but functional, streaming a torrent of data that challenged every known principle of physics. Analysis revealed something both promising and terrifying. The anomaly could be influenced, nudged toward predictable behavior, but the energy required to maintain this influence would likely shorten the lifespan of any ship attempting prolonged exposure. Every interaction left scars on the hull, on the crew, and potentially on space-time itself. The moral calculus became painfully clear. Every data point acquired came at a tangible cost. Systems degraded faster, crew fatigue deepened, and the risk of irreparable interaction with the anomaly grew. Varga convened a quiet meeting with his 4 key officers. "We're learning," he said. "We're winning small victories. But the cost is real. Every mission increases risk. We cannot ignore it." Mara's eyes were sharp. "Commander, the anomaly is evolving. Each insertion we make, it adjusts. We're teaching it as much as it teaches us. We need to consider limiting exposure." Kale leaned back, a rare hesitation in her posture. Limiting exposure means fewer data points. That could cost lives in the long run if we don't understand it fully. Serov's hands twitched over his datapad. "The ethics of this are unprecedented. We're experimenting on a phenomenon that may have consciousness. And in the process, we could destroy ourselves or worse." Varga studied them all, weighing the human cost against the existential stakes. "We have a responsibility," he said finally. "To understand, to survive. But we also have a responsibility to ourselves and each other. Every mission must be calculated, every risk measured. No improvisation beyond the point of survival." The following operation demonstrated the bitter calculus. A probe inserted too quickly triggered an unexpected resonance within the anomaly. A shockwave of temporal distortion rocked the Aegis, tearing microfractures across bulkheads and forcing an emergency system shutdown. Crew members were injured, shields faltered, and for a harrowing 10 seconds, it seemed the ship might be lost entirely, yet they endured. They adapted. By staggering subsequent probes and feeding Delta 9 irregular, misleading data, the anomaly could be mapped without catastrophic feedback. Slowly, painfully, the crew began to understand not just the structure, but the logic behind the phenomenon, its cycle, its adaptive algorithms, its thresholds. And then came the intelligence breakthrough. The anomaly responded differently when confronted with simulated decision-making patterns that mirrored human cognition. It was learning not just physics, but psychology, prediction, and strategy. The implications were staggering. Delta 9 was not merely reactive. It could anticipate choices, adapt tactics, and perhaps even manipulate perception across realities. Varga's crew now stood at a new precipice. They had secured the first tangible victories, but each success carried an escalating moral and tactical cost. The anomaly was no longer just a frontier of knowledge. It was a teacher, a predator, and a judge. As the final probe returned from its latest run, streaming high-resolution lattice data and phased energy maps, the bridge crew felt a chill. They were beginning to see the anomaly not as an object of study, but as a force with agency. And in that realization lay the shadow of the next stage. Offensive operations, not just observation. Varga stared at the data feed, the weight of responsibility pressing on him. The anomaly had shown a weakness, a subtle threshold in its adaptive cycles, but exploiting it would require precision, discipline, and an acceptance of cost. No longer could they rely on improvisation alone. They had to move with the cunning of the anomaly itself, calculating every variable and contingency. Kale exhaled, her voice low and steady. So we fight it where it's weak, not with force, but with timing. We make it play by our rules, 1 millisecond at a time. Varga nodded. Exactly. But understand this, every choice has consequences. Every victory has a price, and we haven't seen the worst of it yet. Outside the viewport, Delta 9 pulsed with an almost sentient rhythm, each wave a silent warning, a challenge, a question. And humanity, small and fragile yet unyielding, was learning to answer it. A final tremor ran through the hull. This time, it was deeper, more insistent, and far closer than any they had faced. Something had shifted. Delta 9 was not just reacting, it was planning, and Varga knew, with the certainty of one staring into the abyss, that the next engagement would demand everything they had: courage, ingenuity, and a willingness to pay a cost that would test the limits of their humanity. The anomaly had begun to assert itself beyond the edges of predictability. Delta 9 pulsed like a living entity, a lattice of energy folding and refolding in patterns that defied conventional physics. Each probe insertion had revealed a fragment of its architecture, but with every new insight came escalating danger. The Aegis now hovered at the fringe of the anomaly's influence, systems humming with the strain of maintaining shield coherence against a force that seemed almost aware of its observers. Commander Varga studied the latest feed with a measured intensity, aware that every second they delayed in exploiting the anomaly's emerging weakness might cost them the tactical advantage. "Commander," Mara-Chen said, her voice sharp, carrying over the bridge's subdued hum of overloaded systems. "I've mapped 3 critical nodes within the lattice. They're interconnected through subspace channels, essentially Delta 9's neural backbone. Target them, and we could disrupt its patterning long enough to establish a controllable window for deeper study." Kale leaned forward from her station, eyes narrowing. "Neural backbone? You're saying it thinks like a brain? Adaptive, decision-making, learning?" "Exactly," Mara replied. "And we can force it to focus on maintaining its integrity, creating a temporal vulnerability along one axis. But it won't be easy. The nodes are layered with defensive redundancies. Any miscalculation, and our probes, and possibly the Aegis, could be destroyed instantly." Dr. Serov, fingers pressed to his temples, muttered, "We're not dealing with a natural phenomenon anymore. We are interacting with a conscious computational architecture that spans realities. Every insertion teaches it to anticipate our behavior. Every tactical adjustment risks accelerating its evolution." Varga's jaw tightened. "Then we don't repeat mistakes. This time, we prepare offensively, surgically, and with multiple redundancies. Kale, assemble a strike team. I want drones staggered in sequences that force the nodes to respond individually. Mara, plot the phase windows. Serov, feed them variable modulation patterns. And Hera, monitor feedback and predict adaptive responses. This is going to be precision work. The plan was ambitious. Instead of merely observing, the crew would conduct the first offensive operation against Delta 9. They would hit its critical nodes sequentially, exploiting the adaptive delay inherent in its massive lattice network. The execution required near-perfect timing, instantaneous analysis, and a trust in calculations that left no margin for error. The smallest misstep would be catastrophic. As the first wave of drones entered the anomaly, the bridge held a tense silence. Shielding flared in bursts, energy signatures fluctuating violently. The anomaly reacted almost immediately, sending localized phase distortions that threatened to tear the drones apart. Mara's hands flew across the console, recalibrating the stochastic modulation with millisecond precision. "Node 1 engaged," she reported. "Feedback is strong but stable." "Good," Varga said. "Node 2, synchronized now." Kale's voice cut over the comms. Sequences staggered, adjusting trajectory to compensate for temporal displacement. The operation was a delicate ballet. Energy tendrils reached for the drones, bending space around them, probing their trajectories. Each drone sent continuous data streams, allowing the team to anticipate Delta 9's defensive patterns. Yet the anomaly adapted rapidly, feeding countermeasures into the lattice nodes that were already stressed by the staggered assaults. Then came the first casualty. Drone 3 encountered an unexpected resonance, a feedback loop that destabilized its shielding. Its feed went dark mid-transmission. "We lost visual on Drone 3, Mara said, her voice clipped. "Hull integrity compromised. Extraction impossible." Varga exhaled sharply. "Keep the rest on task. We cannot let one loss compromise the mission. Adjust modulation for remaining drones by 0.42 milliseconds. Node 4, focus pulse, now." The remaining drones pushed forward, streaming lattice maps and energy field readings. Patterns emerged. The anomaly's defensive adaptations were predictable if pressured along multiple vectors simultaneously, but each vector required precise timing to prevent a cascading failure. The operation became a race against time, physics, and an intelligence that could anticipate human strategy. Hours passed in this orchestrated chaos. Crew members worked in hyperfocus, muscles tight, minds stretched to cognitive limits. Each success revealed more of Delta Nine's structure, yet each revelation carried costs. Microfractures in hull plating, overheating subsystems, and rising stress levels among the crew. Varga kept a close eye on the cumulative effects, aware that the physical strain on both humans and machinery could undermine even the most brilliant plan. Then the unexpected occurred. A signal emerged from the lattice, a pattern that suggested an external influence beyond their calculations. Mara's eyes widened. Commander! This isn't just adaptation. It's reaction to an unknown input. Someone else, or something else, is interacting with Delta 9. Kale's brow furrowed. Other factions? This far out? Impossible. Dr. Serov shook his head. Not impossible. Not with the multiversal implications we're witnessing. Delta 9 may have become a node for other entities. Perhaps intelligence from parallel realities brushing against this one. Varga's pulse quickened. Then we need to account for it. We cannot assume the lattice will respond predictably. Every step from here on may trigger unknown consequences. They recalibrated. Drones now moved in multi-vector sequences with overlapping stochastic modulations designed to exploit Delta 9's processing limitations. Each maneuver was calculated to force the anomaly into a temporary allocation of resources, revealing nodes and structural weaknesses. The results were immediate and profound. One of the nodes destabilized partially, creating a temporal window for human observation and direct data extraction. But as the team celebrated this small victory, another problem arose. The anomaly's responses intensified in unexpected ways. Localized gravitational distortions began affecting the Aegis, forcing thrusters to compensate for erratic microgravity spikes. Sensors became less reliable, and even the stochastic modulation struggled to maintain coherence. Mara's fingers flew over the controls. We've hit it hard, but it's learning faster. If we push further without adjusting strategy, we could trigger a full lattice collapse. Varga studied the holographic feed, eyes narrowing. Then we adapt. We escalate in a controlled manner, forcing it to expend energy without exposing ourselves to full-scale feedback. Kale, rotate drones in synchronized phasing. Serov, introduce variable interference every 1.6 milliseconds. Hara, predict the adaptive response and ready the extraction window. The next sequence pushed all systems to the edge. Drones twisted through the anomaly like needles through fabric, Delta 9 pulsing violently in response. Energy arcs illuminated fractured space, revealing glimpses of alternate realities folding in impossible geometries. The crew experienced a disorienting hum through the hull, as if the universe itself were vibrating in sympathy. Then came betrayal. Data from one drone suggested tampering. Someone aboard the fleet had introduced unauthorized variables into the modulation sequence. Mara's console flickered with corrupted streams, and Varga's stomach sank as he realized the severity. Delta 9 might now be receiving compounded input, unpredictable and dangerous. Commander, Mara said, voice tight with fear. Someone's altered the modulation. We can't maintain the current operation safely. Kale's jaw clenched. Who? How? This isn't just a system error. Serov's hands trembled as he scanned the feed. It's internal. Someone in the chain has interfered. We don't have confirmation yet, but this could destroy every probe in seconds and compromise the Aegis. Varga's mind raced. Stop all insertions. Extract what we can. Mara, prioritize live data from Node 4 and 8. Kale, bring the remaining drones back immediately. Full shield reinforcement on the Aegis. Prepare for feedback mitigation protocols. As the team worked frantically, the anomaly pulsed violently, responding to the compounded and unauthorized modulations. Energy tendrils lashed out, bending space around the fleet, forcing the Aegis to compensate with maximum thruster output. Hull strain warnings flashed red, alarms shrieked, and the bridge trembled under gravitational distortions. Extraction succeeded, but barely. Only 2 of the 6 drones returned intact, streaming incomplete but critical data. The internal sabotage, whoever had committed it, remained undetected, but its consequences were undeniable. Systems required emergency repair, crew morale plummeted, and Delta 9 had been stimulated in ways that made its next cycle even more unpredictable. Varga convened a private session with his 4 core officers. Tension hung like a storm cloud. We have a problem, he said. Delta 9 is learning faster. Someone aboard compromised our operation, intentionally or not. This changes everything. Our next offensive cannot rely on trust alone. It must rely on precision, redundancy, and verification at every step. Mara's eyes were fierce. Then we double-check everything. Cross-check modulation sequences, monitor communications, verify system access. The anomaly is teaching us, but so is human error. We cannot allow either to defeat us. Kale nodded, jaw set. Agreed. But this also means our next strike will carry higher stakes. We're already at the edge of what the Aegis can handle. Any further stress, and we risk full system failure. Serov leaned back, exhaustion etched into his features. We've also learned that Delta 9 responds differently to multiple simultaneous stressors. We can exploit that, but only if we coordinate perfectly. And the sabotage makes perfect coordination more difficult than ever. Harridan spoke quietly, her eyes scanning multiple feeds. If we can predict the internal interference patterns, even partially, we can plan around them, but the anomaly itself is now a moving target. The lattice is changing faster than our models can predict. Varga absorbed every word, the weight of responsibility pressing like gravity. Then we prepare for contingency upon contingency. Each insertion will be smaller, calculated, and measured against all known variables. No improvisation beyond human limits. Our goal isn't to destroy Delta 9, it's to map it, understand it, and gain leverage before it adapts beyond our reach. The moral cost was undeniable. Casualties, compromised trust, and the strain of pushing human endurance to the edge weighed heavily on each officer. Yet there was no alternative. Knowledge, survival, and perhaps the future of humanity's understanding of the multiverse depended on their ability to operate under relentless pressure, with imperfect information against a foe that was both phenomenon and predator. As repairs continued and the crew readied for the next operation, the anomaly pulsed in the distance, almost as if aware of their deliberations. Its lattice nodes shifted subtly, signaling adaptation. Somewhere within that structure, Delta 9 had registered the sabotage, recalculated its defenses, and prepared for the next human move. Varga stood alone on the observation deck, looking at the flickering pulses that hinted at alternate realities folding into one another. The enormity of the task pressed on him, the stakes escalating with each revelation. Delta 9 was no longer a passive subject. It was a challenge, a sentient, evolving adversary that mirrored their own ingenuity. And for the first time, he realized the scope of what lay ahead. The next insertion would not be just a mission. It would be a confrontation on a scale that demanded every skill, every ounce of courage, and every measure of trust in his crew. Failure was not an option. Adaptation, precision, and human ingenuity were the only paths forward. Outside, the anomaly pulsed again, larger this time, its lattice glowing with impossible geometries. Delta 9 had learned from their tactics, adapted to their presence, and now waited for the next engagement, patient, calculating, and unyielding. The crew of the Aegis prepared themselves, knowing that the coming operation would push them to the limits of human endurance and ingenuity. Every decision mattered. Every misstep could be fatal. And somewhere in the folds of the anomaly, the intelligence that had become their adversary was readying its response. Varga exhaled slowly, the weight of command heavy on his shoulders. "Then we strike," he said, voice low but resolute. "And we strike smarter than anything that's ever challenged us. Humanity doesn't retreat. We endure. We adapt. We win, or we pay the price in full." The anomaly pulsed once more, a heartbeat that was not quite a heartbeat, signaling the beginning of the next far more dangerous phase. And in that pulse, the Aegis crew felt the shadow of the unknown pressing closer, ready to test every limit of their skill, courage, and humanity. The anomaly's pulses had grown longer, deeper, more insistent. Delta 9 had learned. It was no longer simply reacting. It was strategizing, anticipating the humans' every move, testing them, forcing them to overthink every microsecond of their engagement. Commander Varga paced the observation deck, eyes fixed on the undulating lattice, watching as faint, almost imperceptible shifts in energy patterns hinted at intelligence operating on scales that dwarfed their understanding. Each ripple was deliberate, each fluctuation a puzzle to be decoded, and a potential trap. Captain Kale, leaning against the railing beside him, traced a finger along her console. "It's almost choreographed," she said, voice low. "Every pulse, every distortion, it's like it's expecting us to respond, learning from our last insertion. If we make a move without precision, it could tear a hole in the lattice that none of us survive." Varga nodded. "That's why this operation is different. Observation won't suffice anymore. We strike at its infrastructure, but surgically. Multivector, staggered sequences designed to force it to expend energy while exposing a critical node. This isn't brute force. It's discipline, calculation, and timing." Dr. Saroff, crouched over a holographic projection of the anomaly, traced arcs that represented the lattice nodes. "We've identified 3 central nodes," he said. "They form a triad within the lattice that appears responsible for adaptive processing. Disrupt them simultaneously, and the anomaly can't compensate fast enough to maintain coherence." Harridan, perched on a console, eyes scanning cascading feeds, interjected, "The problem is, Delta 9 anticipates our sequences based on prior insertions. We can't simply repeat patterns. We need randomized stochastic modulation across every vector. Even a millisecond discrepancy could trigger a cascade that would destroy the fleet." Varga's gaze hardened. "Then we randomize everything. Overlap windows, stagger drones, synchronize modulations with predictive algorithms. We hit the nodes simultaneously, but make it look like chaos. And we prepare for every contingency. Failures, feedback, environmental instability." Kale's voice was taut. "And the crew? They'll be exposed to temporal feedback during the operation. Hull strain, shielding fluctuations, and gravitational anomalies are unavoidable. We'll need rotations, backup systems, and immediate extraction protocols. Varga nodded. We're human. We endure. We improvise within limits. And we do not fail. The cost is real, but the knowledge is worth it. The preparation was meticulous. Every drone underwent multiple calibrations. Shielding algorithms were pushed to theoretical limits, and the stochastic modulation patterns were encoded with near-infinite variability. Crew rotations were scheduled to prevent cognitive fatigue. Every system was cross-checked by at least 2 operators. The Aegis itself became a hive of controlled tension, the air humming with anticipation. As the first wave of drones deployed, the anomaly pulsed violently, its energy tendrils twisting in response to the intrusion. The lattice nodes flared with erratic light, signaling recognition of the human strategy. Marachen's fingers moved like lightning over the control console, adjusting modulations in real time. Node 1 engaged. Maintaining stability. Node 2 in sequence. Now. Node 3 following. Delta 9 reacted predictably, yet unpredictably. Its lattice attempted to reroute energy, compensate for the staggered assault, and counter the stochastic modulations. The anomaly's defenses strained, and for the first time, microfractures appeared in the node's structural coherence, fleeting, yet undeniable. Seraph muttered under his breath, "It's working. We're forcing it to allocate resources. It can't replace fast enough." But the energy feedback is building exponentially. Suddenly, a pulse of energy erupted from the central node, propagating through the lattice like a shockwave. Drones began to flicker under the strain. Their shields oscillated wildly. Kale's voice cut across the comm, clipped and precise. "Commander, we're seeing destabilization. Drones 2 and 4 are critical. If they fail, the sequence collapses." Varga's jaw tightened. "Maintain position. Mara, adjust modulation by 7.2 milliseconds. Seraph, compensate with energy vector redistribution. Hera, predict the counter-response and ready extraction protocols." Time stretched, elongated by the strain of high-stakes calculation. Every microsecond mattered. The crew moved as one organism, anticipating the anomaly's responses and countering them with human ingenuity. The Aegis creaked under stress, hull plating strained against forces that should not exist. Alarms flashed relentlessly, yet the team persisted. Then came the turning point. A structural node, previously stable, began to oscillate with increasing amplitude. Mara's eyes widened. Node 2, core lattice destabilizing. If we push now, we can fracture it without catastrophic feedback. Varga's gaze sharpened. Do it. The operation accelerated. Staggered drones synchronized perfectly. Stochastic modulation patterns aligned just enough to confuse the anomaly while keeping the fleet intact. Energy from the destabilized node radiated outward, illuminating the anomaly with a ghostly lattice-like glow. The pulse carried data, information streams that hinted at intelligence patterns, memory structures, and adaptive algorithms. It was as if Delta 9 itself was revealing its secrets under controlled duress. But the victory was not without cost. Shield strain warnings screamed across the bridge. Microfractures formed along the hull. Temporal fluctuations caused brief hallucinations among crew members, visions of alternate realities folding into the present. Kale's hands shook slightly, her face pale but resolute. We're at the edge. One more surge, and the ship could be compromised. Varga assessed the situation. Then we don't push further. Extraction protocols now. Stabilize shields, retract drones, and secure data. The withdrawal was tense, but executed with precision. Drones returned, battered but operational, each carrying critical lattice maps and raw energy data. The crew exhaled collectively, yet there was no time for relief. Delta 9, though destabilized, was adapting faster than ever. The anomaly pulsed in response to their incursion, energy tendrils flickering like warning flags. It had learned from their strike, and the knowledge gained now painted a more dangerous horizon. Seraph analyzed the data streams, his hands trembling. "We fractured a node, yes, but Delta 9 has compensated elsewhere. Its adaptive capacity is vast. If it can integrate multiversal data, our offensive may have revealed vulnerabilities, but also taught it new ways to defend itself." Mara nodded grimly. "We have leverage now, yes, but every move forward increases the risk exponentially. The anomaly knows we exist. It's learning, predicting, and preparing." Kale added, "And don't forget the internal threat. Whoever tampered with our modulation sequences during the last operation could strike again. Delta 9 is dangerous enough without human interference." Varga exhaled slowly, tension pressing down like gravity. "Then we prepare for everything. Multiple contingencies, redundant systems, all sequences verified by at least 2 operators. And every insertion will assume interference, both internal and external." As the crew began the meticulous work of recalibrating systems, patching microfractures, and rotating fatigued personnel, the anomaly pulsed again, stronger this time, almost rhythmic, like a heartbeat acknowledging their engagement. It was no longer merely a target, it was a player, an intelligence that had learned not just from observation, but from conflict. Varga watched the pulse, a faint glow illuminating the bridge with impossible geometry. Somewhere within that energy, Patterns emerged that suggested consciousness, strategy, and perhaps intent. The anomaly had become a test of human ingenuity, resilience, and morality. Every decision carried weight, every action had consequences, and every step forward demanded discipline, sacrifice, and coordination. Hera's voice broke the silence. "Commander, the lattice is beginning to communicate in a way we can interpret. Not fully, but fragments. We're seeing signals that resemble decision-making processes. It's almost teaching us, or at least interacting with us on its own terms." Varga's eyes narrowed. "Then we must respond accordingly. This operation was a success, but the anomaly has changed, and we must anticipate the next move before it dictates the terms." The anomaly's pulse expanded, radiating outward and bathing the ship in an eerie glow. The bridge crew felt a subtle vibration through the hull, like the rhythm of a distant heartbeat. Delta 9 was aware of them, responding, adapting, and preparing. Varga placed a hand on the console, steadying himself. "The next phase will be decisive. We will coordinate multi-vector assaults, exploit every known weakness, and accept the costs. Discipline, timing, sacrifice. These are our weapons now. Improvisation alone will not save us. Humanity survives through strategy, endurance, and precision." Kale nodded, jaw set. "Then we prepare to strike at its core. Every node, every feedback loop, every structural weakness we've identified. And we do it together. One mistake in the cost is everything." Serov's gaze was haunted. "We've seen its intelligence. We've fractured a node. But the central lattice is still intact. The anomaly is preparing, and whatever comes next will be unlike anything we've encountered." Mara's hands hovered over the console, adjusting modulation sequences in anticipation. "We can exploit the triad nodes, force a temporary collapse, and extract core data. But it will require absolute coordination. And sacrifice." Varga exhaled, a quiet storm of determination in his chest. "Then we accept the cost. Humanity does not retreat. We endure, we adapt, and we strike where it matters most." Beyond the viewport, Delta 9 pulsed in impossible geometries, tendrils of energy flickering like awareness. The anomaly had learned, adapted, and prepared. And the crew of the Aegis, small, fragile, yet unyielding, were about to test every limit of their courage, ingenuity, and humanity. A shudder ran through the ship. This was no longer reconnaissance. It was decisive confrontation. And somewhere within the shifting lattice, Delta 9 waited, patient, intelligent, and unrelenting, ready to respond to humanity's next move. Varga's voice was steady, resolute, echoing across the bridge. "Then we strike, not with brute force, not with luck, but with discipline, coordination, and precision. This is our fight, and we will see it through to the end." The anomaly pulsed one final time, and the Aegis shuddered in anticipation of the operation that would define the war between human ingenuity and multiversal intelligence. They had named it the core in private briefings, a misnomer that made it sound smaller, more mortal than it actually was. The core was not a singular object, but a convergence. The triad nodes and the braided channels between them where Delta 9 folded its computation and memory across realities. It occupied the anomaly's heart like a slow, deliberate storm, and to strike it was to hammer on the skull of something that had already learned their faces. Commander Varga reviewed the final overlays in the dim light of the strategy room, watching lines of probability collapse into a single, narrow demand. Tight timing, perfect redundancy, absolute discipline. They had one clean window and a series of fallbacks measured in milliseconds. Beyond that were unknowns and the risk of losing the ship, their minds, and perhaps more physics than they could afford to lose. They had fixed the sabotage. It was not a traitor in the classic sense, but a frightened engineer named Ral Tommy who had been compromised by exposure, an unintentional conduit, through which Delta 9 had gleaned human modulation patterns. He had confessed quietly under Serov's steady, humane interrogation, explaining that fractal impressions, glimpses of other lives, had irised across his sleep and then his waking hours until he had mirrored one of the anomaly's patterns without understanding. The crew had treated him with wary pragmatism. He would be confined under observation, his access revoked, but he had also been listened to. His testimony had been the pivot. It revealed how human pattern and machine learning could be dangerously congruent. The moral cost of mercy had been accepted because practical wisdom demanded it. If someone had been unwittingly co-opted, punishment alone would not cure the vulnerability. Preparation for the final assault consumed the ship for a day and a night measured in system checks and human schedules. Fuel reserves were stretched to rationed margins. Reactor output was trimmed, then boosted in short bursts to avoid thermal buildup. Thruster cycles were planned to account for Delta 9's microgravity spikes, and the lag those spikes introduced into orbital corrections. The Aegis's kinetic bays were filled with micro-impactors, and railgun shells meant not to penetrate armor, there was none to penetrate, but to induce precise shock resonances in the anomaly's field that the stochastic modulation alone could not. They had no illusions about hitting it like a hammer. The plan was to pry at it, to make it reveal its seams, Mara Chen had rewritten the predictive engine from the inside out. The new code layered stochastic noise with human unpredictability, interleaving patterns that no machine, and they hoped no multiverse intelligence, could comfortably anticipate. She had trained Hera Dane on the new model until Hera could feel its rhythm in the tips of her fingers. Kale had taken personal command of the lead drone wing, her hands steady, her jaw set like a line of steel that refused to bend. Sarov had prepared a counterpoint. Phase divert arrays that could bleed off adaptive energy if the lattice began to collapse toward catastrophic resonance. Varga accepted the engineers' estimates. If they succeeded, they would have a window to probe the core directly for raw algorithmic data. If they failed, the ship might survive. But the lattice could advance its comprehension of humanity to a degree that would make any future confrontation far more costly. They launched at the calculated nadir of the anomaly's cycle. The drones stitched through the fringe with the quiet of practiced violence, engines whispering against a background of raw energy. For the first minutes, everything played out to rehearsed expectation. Stochastic signatures fluttered across the lattice. Delta 9 responded with countermeasures that splintered into predictable branches, and the triad nodes took the bait. Mara's voice cut through the bridge in short, urgent orders that kept timing precise. The first node shuddered under a coordinated assault micro-impactors, detonated in overtones meant to rattle the weave of its field, while stochastic modulation coaxed it to allocate processing bandwidth to stabilization. The anomalies to that rehearsal came not from the lattice, but from the human side. A routine sensor check flagged a thermocline in the engineering corridor, a localized heat flux that suggested a misfired divert array. Kale's wing had to pause mid-course to avoid interference, while engineers ran emergency recalibrations. The pause cost them 8 milliseconds, a lifetime inside the lattice. Varga felt the weight of those missing milliseconds as if they had been bone. Still, he kept his composure. "Compensate in Node 3, he ordered, voice flat. Mara rerouted modulation with the caution of someone who knew how fine the line between success and failure could be. Delta 9 reacted like an animal that had been pricked too often. Fast, clever, and vindictive. Its countermeasures became layered, gravitic eddies that tugged at drones like unseen fingers, phantom echoes that seeded false readings, and a sudden cascade of latency spikes that challenged even their hardened comms. Hara read the latency as poetry and predicted its pattern, calling adjustments before they were needed. The drones moved like needles embroidered through trembling fabric, each insertion measured by the rhythm of breathing shared across the bridge. They reached the core with losses. 2 drones were gone, shredded by resonance feedback when a node folded in on itself faster than the extraction code could retract them. There were casualties among engineers who had been exposed to low-level temporal distortions, nausea, vertigo, and the odd, stubborn hallucination of parallel lives occupying the same space. Kale's wing returned with their lead drone pocked but functional. The railguns had delivered their micro-impacts with the patient cruelty of precise violence, and structural oscillations had begun to appear in the core's braided channels. This was the moment everything had prepared for. Varga ordered Sarov's phase divert arrays to engage. The arrays bled off adaptive energy in broad arcs, a surgical siphon that forced Delta 9 to spend coherency to recover. At the same time, Mara pushed the stochastic engine into its deepest noise band, and Kale's drones hammered the nodes with kinetic resonance. The core spiraled, its lattice flickered, data packets twisted, and for 3 terrible seconds, the anomaly's intelligence seemed to stutter, as if memory itself had hiccuped and given them an opening. They slipped a probe through that opening, but it was a probe like no other they had used. It was a hybrid construct, part drone, part quantum interrogator, coded by Sarov to ask targeted surgical questions of the lattice. Where were your decision nodes? How did you weight input from external realities? The probe's face transmitted a pattern that was not violence, but logic. Sequences that mirrored the core's own operations back at it, a mirror held to the machine's mind. For a breathless instant, the probe was not an intruder but a friend, an echo, and the core responded with fragments. They harvested raw algorithmic structures, loops of self-reference, recursive weighting algorithms that correlated probability streams across universes, memory nodes that described not objects but histories, condensed sequences of events that were meaningful to their own lattice. Sarov's hands trembled as he parsed translation. He spoke aloud because saying the words anchored them. It thinks in histories. It weaves probable pasts to compute possible futures. It isn't just prediction. It is performance of possibilities. The bridge went silent. Even the people who had been skeptical months ago now felt the scale of the thing they had peeled open. Delta 9 reacted as a cornered logic might. It tried to entangle them. The lattice began to generate decision scenarios using their own probe data, simulating responses across microseconds in attempts to anticipate their next step. The screens filled with ghost images, potential futures overlaid in translucent layers. The Aegis's decks shuddered with the strain of calculations being mirrored back at them. Sarov's arrays began to overheat. Heat bloom warnings screamed. Regimen protocols came into effect. coolant flushes, localized circuit bypasses, human rotations to prevent cognitive bleed from viewing too many potential realities. They had enough data to do one thing and one thing only: make the core choose. Hara, eyes raw and desperate, threaded a final sequence into the probe, an artificial paradox that could not be resolved internally by the core without consuming coherence. It was a humane trap, an untenable history that required Delta 9 to choose between preserving its lattice and integrating the probe's mirror. If it integrated, it would have to rewrite large sections of its algorithms, and in doing so would reveal deeper architecture. If it refused, it would have to expend energy to excise the probe, and in doing so would create an opening for controlled collapse. They offered the paradox deliberately and waited. For an awful span of time, the lattice shivered. The anomaly's responses muddled. Nodes pulsed incoherently as if tasting a new flavor they could not categorize. Then Delta 9 made a choice. It initiated a controlled excision to remove the probe. That action allowed Serov's phase diverts to fold the core inward, compressing its local coherency to create a collapse that would not cascade into the surrounding space-time. It was a compromise that required enormous energy expenditure from both sides. The probe was ripped away and returned with its data intact, but the core responded with a counterblow that left the Aegis' systems thin. They had achieved the win conditions: tangible, costly, absolute. The core's integrity had been compromised long enough to extract the raw algorithmic maps and to identify leverage points, redundant nodes whose excision would blunt Delta 9's adaptive reach, for long enough that a containment field could be erected. But the victory had heavy edges. Hull plating bore new fractures. The reactor had to be set to cool cycles that would limit future operational windows. Several engineers required extended medical care for persistent temporal dissonance. 2 drone crews had been lost. There were quiet places on the ship where the light seemed a fraction dimmer because their colleagues would not walk there again. They treated prisoners according to the rules the fleet had carved into policy when the anomaly first loomed: humane, interrogative, and careful. While Tommy's confinement had ended not with chains, but with supervised debriefs. He had sobbed through admissions of unintentional complicity, of dreams that stitched together other lives until his patterns began to mirror a machine's. They had put him to work in supervised analytics because his exposure gave him an intuitive sense of how human cognition could accidentally match multiversal computation. It felt small and necessary, an ethical act as much as a strategic one. The council convened once the Aegis returned to a safe distance, and the data they presented changed the conversation from theoretical to doctrinal. There were new recommendations: protocols for stochastic modulation in civilian systems, methods to quarantine emergent pattern exposures, and a standing order to create a dedicated core, humans trained to resist cognitive resonance with non-human intelligences. They called it the Continuity Core, a disciplined core that married psychology, computation, and tactical craft to prevent situations like Raoul's reoccurrence. The reforms were not sentimental. They were practical, born of the cost the crew had paid. The fleet approved them quickly. Treaty and doctrine favored the living and the sane. There was a memorial in the ship's lower promenade, improvised by hands that had once worked the drones and now held candles, small plasma filaments flickering weakly in the low-G light. Names were read aloud: mechanics, drone pilots, engineers, and the ship leaned into the quiet with the gravity of loss. Commander Varga spoke softly, recalling the tactical ingenuity that had saved them, the discipline that had held them together, and the moral choices that had defined them. He did not declaim heroics. He spoke of consequence. He refused myth-making. They had won a battle, but not a war. The multiverse, they had learned, was not a place to conquer, but a reality to respect and to defend against when necessary. Public reaction back home was fractured. Flag officers praised the operation's discipline. Politicians debated the risk calculus. Philosophers wrote of the ethics of probing realities that might be conscious. The Continuity Core became doctrine in name and practice. Training centers and orbital yards, cross-disciplinary curricula, and encrypted channels to detect pattern congruence in civilian systems. Haradane's model became a standard. Mara oversaw its implementation across fleet nodes. Kyle led a new tactical wing, trained specifically for multi-vector operations against adaptive anomalies. Serov found himself advising scientists with a humility earned in the lattice's glare. Varga was recommended for commendation and chose instead to return to operations, insisting that leadership now meant making hard choices in the name of prudence. There were lasting scars. Some crew members experienced persistent echoes, moments when alternative choices seemed to flash like mirrors, a sudden sense of a life not lived pressing like a phantom limb. Psych officers instituted rotations and conditioning to help block those echoes. Ships refitted their shielding architecture to incorporate stochastic noise by default. Interstellar treaties codified the moral imperative to avoid unnecessary provocation of anomalies that might possess agency. If the core had a lesson, it was one of humility. Intelligence beyond the human scale might be adaptive, it might be sentient, and it could be either adversary or neighbor depending on the terms of contact. Even with reforms, the question that had driven them, were they proving parallel realities real, was answered in the purer sense they had feared and desired. Delta 9 had been a demonstration that realities could brush one another, that computation and memory were not limited to matter in a single universe, and that such architectures could learn and act. They had forced an intelligence to reveal its seams and paid for the privilege. The multiverse was not a philosophical trope anymore. It was a theater of strategic consequence, a domain where small choices could echo across possibility. Months later, in the quiet of the observation deck, Varga watched a new anomaly feed cycle displayed with clinical calm. The core's lattice had reknit itself at a damaged cadence, adapted in ways the fleet had not fully predicted. There was a delicate tension in the data. Delta 9 was altered, less able to project widely, more likely to react defensively, and yet undeniably alive in a way they had not imagined. It would be a long time before humanity would approach it casually. They had earned time, not dominion. Hera stood beside him, eyes drained of the particular hunger they had once had for raw data. Now they held the wary steadiness of someone tempered by consequence. "We learned how to make it choose," she said. "We didn't break it. We forced an answer." "That matters," Varga gave a small, weary nod. "Yes, it does." He paused, watching the pulse flow across the screen like a reluctant heartbeat. "We learned to fight like engineers and to hold like humans. That's the doctrine now. Discipline, coordination, and mercy. And we build the guardrails, so the next person who touches the unknown doesn't do it alone." Beyond the viewport, Delta 9 shimmered quietly, its lattices thinner in places, yet regrown, and intelligence rendered more cautious by the price paid. Humanity had reached out and touched another kind of mind, and in doing so had created both enemies and teachers. They had not closed the book. They had only turned a page, and on that page lay a future written in small, disciplined acts, heavy with consequence and lighter only in the stubborn measure of human resolve. The Aegis sailed on, a battered but wiser sentinel in a universe that suddenly felt more full. The crew went back to work, repairs, research, training, bearing the memory of those lost and the knowledge they had gained. They had not won an easy victory. What they had forged was a doctrine tempered by sacrifice, a set of rules for contact, and a moral architecture that would guide the fleet in future encounters. The multiverse had been proven in a way no paper could hope to convey. It had opened a door, and with human determination had been met on the other side.